hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss today has to do with fame, the Buddha and fame. To begin with, the Buddha was inarguably one of the most famous people who ever lived, known by billions of people worldwide over thousands of years. So we might think that he was the sort of person who went out looking for fame, who was interested in gaining fame for himself. But interestingly, that seems not to have been the case. 3 parallel suttas in the early tradition discuss a visit that the Buddha made to a small town named Ichanangala. And it's said that the people of Ichanangala, the householders there, were particularly interested in meeting the Buddha, in coming and hearing him talk, that we might say the Buddha's fame had preceded him to that village. And as the Buddha was approaching this village, he was hearing the noise of these householders who wanted to meet him, and the Buddha remarked to his close attendant, who at the time was a man named Nagita, a monk named Nagita. It was not at the time when his most famous attendant was around, named Ananda. This was Nagita. And so the Buddha said, "Nagita, may I never become famous. May fame not come to me. There are those who can't get the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of awakening when they want, without trouble or difficulty like I can. Let them enjoy the filthy, lazy pleasure of possessions, honor, and popularity." So here the Buddha pretty clearly is not interested in fame, that he actually doesn't want to become famous. Fame is a burden to him. And having said this, his attendant Nagita tried to convince the Buddha to, in fact, see these householders from Ichanangala, because he felt that it would be to their benefit to hear a Dharma talk from him, that they would learn something from it, that they could make their lives better. And so he attempted to convince the Buddha. And this attempt to convince may remind some of us of other times, or famous times in the early texts that describe the Buddha's attitude towards just this kind of fame. For example, we can think of a time just after the Buddha's enlightenment when, for at least a period, the Buddha doubted whether he would actually go on to teach. He thought to himself, the Buddha said to have thought to himself, that teaching would be a real burden because most people were really not interested in the kind of Dharma, the kind of teaching that he was going to present them with. That it would be hard to convince a lot of people, that they were too attached to their lives to want to hear his kind of advice. And so he thought for a time of just simply retiring by himself into the forest. And at that time he was actually visited by at least so the story goes, by a deity, the Brahma deity, Brahma Sahampati, who was able to convince the Buddha to actually teach the world. The problems that the Buddha saw with fame are perhaps best illustrated by his interactions with his cousin Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin Devadatta. In the early texts, Devadatta is a kind of a foil to the Buddha, a kind of an evil twin, if you like. Somebody who, it's said, tried to split the Sangha out of a desire for fame. In particular, the suttas record how Devadatta became very well known by a local prince named Prince Ajatasattu, a very powerful and wealthy individual of the time, and how Ajatasattu showered gifts upon Devadatta, gave him lots of things. And having heard about this, the Buddha remarked that these gifts would probably end up being the downfall of Devadatta. The Buddha says, "So brutal are possessions, honor, and popularity." That is to say, gifts, honor, fame, popularity like these can tend to go to somebody's head, somebody who's not well trained. They can pull one off of the path in the right direction and pull us off into the wrong direction. Pull us off towards greed, towards ego, towards anger and hatred, towards jealousy, and other kinds of similar unskillful mental tendencies. And this problem is illustrated in a sutta called the Longer Discourse on the Simile of the Heartwood. In that sutta, the Buddha discusses the downfall of Devadatta as indicating this kind of desire for the wrong sorts of things. And he uses Devadatta's example as an example to all of us, because the same kind of thing could happen to anybody. That is, any of us can be derailed by a desire for fame, honor, popularity, and similar kinds of things. The Buddha discusses how this kind of grasping at fame can lead us to glorify ourselves and to put down others, to engage in this kind of conceit of ourselves versus others. And he compares this, the Buddha compares this to somebody looking for heartwood. Now, heartwood is the hard, dense wood that is at the center of tree trunks, and that is particularly useful for making certain kinds of implements, certain kinds of furniture, and so on. But the Buddha says that if you're looking for heartwood, if there's a person looking for heartwood, and they go to the forest and they come back with leaves, twigs, and bark, they're not going to be able to make the sorts of things that they wanted to with heartwood. The Buddha says, whatever he needs to make from heartwood, he won't succeed. So heartwood is the true goal of our practice, which is the ending of dukkha, the arrival at nirvana, at enlightenment. And we're not going to get there by sort of grasping it and holding to the leaves and twigs and bark of fame and honor and popularity. The Buddha here basically talks about how somebody looking for that will glorify, let's say, their own abilities at meditation, perhaps their own abilities at achieving jhana or certain kinds of formless attainments, or whatever it might be, their ability at gaining wisdom in a certain respect, and they'll look down on other people. Perhaps they'll grasp at their own ethical practices and look down on others as not being up to their standards ethically, or not being as good at meditation as they are, not being able to achieve the depth of jhana that they can. This is the kind of danger that we fall into when we're looking for fame and honor and popularity. We want to be famous by, let's say, our meditative abilities. That's not the point of practice. That's the leaves and twigs, not the heartwood. Indeed, even becoming a monastic can become an item of conceit. If we puff ourselves up, if the monastic puffs him or herself up and says, I'm a monastic, I'm a monk or a nun, and you aren't, so I'm better than you in some important respect, that is another example of grasping at the leaves and twigs and not looking for the heartwood. Another early sutta expands upon this problematic syndrome. In that sutta, the Buddha says, mendicants, that is monastics, possessions, honor, and popularity are an obstacle, even for a mendicant who is perfected with defilements ended. Now, this claim that possessions, honor, popularity, we might say fame, can be an obstacle even to somebody who is, in the Buddha's words, perfected, that is to say, an arahant, an enlightened person, that was a shocking claim. It shocked his attendant, who at the time was Ananda. And the Buddha went on to explain that he didn't mean that it was an obstacle to them being enlightened. They were still enlightened, but rather he meant something a little bit different. The Buddha went on to explain that it didn't obstruct their enlightenment, but I do say that possessions, honor, and popularity obstruct the achievement of blissful meditations in this very life for a meditator who is diligent, keen, and resolute. That is to say, an enlightened person isn't going to be pulled away from their enlightenment, removed from being enlightened by fame, honor, and popularity, but rather that fame, honor, popularity, possessions, these kinds of things can be problematic by diverting their attention away from better ways of spending their life, like being in meditation. It can be a bother. In other words, the Buddha seems to be talking about himself here. If we return to the idea of these people from Ichanangala who who are clamoring to visit with him, and the Buddha himself thinks, perhaps, You know, it would be nice to be able to remain in meditation, in blissful meditation for a little bit longer, but my fame precedes me, and now I cannot. And this is the way that fame can get in the way, even for somebody who is perfectly enlightened. And so as a result, the Buddha says, you should train like this. We will give up arisen possessions, honor, and popularity, and we won't let them occupy our minds. So this is another one of these wonderful paradoxes in practice that we find in Buddhism. This idea of somebody who is famous, perhaps one of the most famous people in all of history, who decries his own fame, who does not like fame, who does not want to be famous, who sees the pitfalls of fame, and indeed urges us to practice so that we give up any thoughts of fame in our own lives, that will make our lives better and easier. And in a similar vein, the Buddha discussed his own difficulties with noise, with practices that involve lots of people and noise and commotion. And I did an earlier video about that, and I'll leave a link to that up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or want to have a refresher. And thanks so much for all of your views and watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here together. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and please be well.